Hello people of the internet, it's Amanda, and if you're new here on my channel, I usually talk about Japanese dramas, movies, and pop culture. Sometimes that extends to other Asian pop culture topics, but for today's video, we're not going to be talking about a specific drama or movie. We're going to be talking about a specific trope that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, something that has been out there for the longest time, something that we still see in media today, and something that we probably have felt conflicted with before, even until now, and how that translates to our fictional versus real life preferences. Now, just a disclaimer before we start, and I say this in my past videos, I'm no expert. This is more of just a sit-down commentary when it comes to pop culture entertainment. Think of it as sitting down and talking to your friend about these types of topics. And yeah, that's how I usually treat my videos. I hope that you enjoyed this one, and let's just get to it. So for today's video, we're going to be talking about the broody bad boy main character trope and how that usually is when it comes to fiction, and just how it translates to our real life preferences, or how it must have affected, I don't know, past preferences when it comes to our relationships, the idea of toxicity, red flags, all these kinds of things. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I've been seeing two types of memes a lot, and I know some of these, like one of this is quite old already, but then some, like this one in particular, I'm not sure what started it. The first one is the your attraction to toxic men started when you preferred X over Y, and one of the kind of like Asian references that they keep on using is choosing Daomingsu versus Watsule from Meet Your Garden. And then in relation to that, for some reason, I've been seeing a lot of like posts on TikTok saying growing up is realizing that Watsule is also a red flag. And I'm just kind of like curious as to where or why we're having these discussions in 2024, since Meet Your Garden is, I know, I mean, that entire phenomena of Meet Your Garden, Hanayori Dango, Boys Over Flowers, I find it very, very fascinating. I have videos, like a playlist dedicated to that, because I absolutely love Boys Over Flowers, Hanayori Dango, and its legacy when it comes to pop culture. I think that Yoko Kamiya did such an amazing job in terms of creating this kind of like relatable, but at the same time aspirational romance narrative that has become its own like timeless piece, and it didn't necessarily age well as it is, given, you know, how F4 is, but like some versions, like the Meet Your Garden 2018 and the F4 Thailand version, which I've also made videos about, showed that, you know, like creatives still find inspiration into creating other iterations of the story because of just simply how timeless it is. And see my videos on Hanayori Dango, Boys Over Flowers, even F4 Thailand, all these other things. I have playlists just talking about this because it's definitely one of my favorite pop culture topics to explore here on my channel. But I think just in itself, you know, it's the epitome of having that broody bad boy main character trope that doesn't necessarily mean that it was the influence for these other, you know, pop culture narratives to create this kind of like dynamic between the female and the main lead, but it definitely sparked a lot of like the enemies to lovers, or kind of like the bad boy being changed by the good girl kind of narrative. And it's basically still everywhere nowadays. I think in Western media, this kind of trope or dynamic has definitely been sized down because, again, of its problematic overarching themes overall. I mean, I've talked about this in my past like F4 Thailand, Hanayori Dango videos, where as much as classic and as timeless as the narrative is, you know, it's not something that sits well in today's age. And I mean, it shouldn't have sat well in our age, as in our previous years as well. But before, like, there's not a lot of sensitivities when it comes to these topics compared to how it is now. And that's just how pop culture and media evolves over time, as we learn from the times and all these things. But again, it's recognizing that this piece of media is still iconic in its own thing. Yeah, so again, that's a conversation for another time. We might also tap into second lead syndrome, but again, I might make a separate video on that as well, and just really focus on the idea of the bad boy, red flag main character, and the certain attraction that goes into it. Now, I think, yes, like Domyoji Tsukasa Damingsu, you know, he is the poster child for like this bad boy trope. And I think just generally, it's both a biological and a media effect conversation when it comes to this particular topic. So I think in fiction, we tend to want to root for characters who are either underdogs, characters who usually we want to project our dreams and aspirations for, especially when it comes to fiction. And there's a lot of limitations as to who we are and what we can do in real life. And we tend to see these flawed characters as kind of like we want to see them succeed because of the aspirational value of it. Like, that's what entertainment is, that's what pop culture is, that's what media is about, is creating these avenues for sometimes escapism or, you know, all these other stuff. And I think just generally, that's what these stories are giving us, is no matter how flawed you can be, no matter how toxic you are, how much of a red flag you are, there will be someone who will be able to stand by you, whether that's within friends, like for example, again with Damingsu and the F4, like no matter how toxic they are as a group, and no matter how Damingsu is kind of like, or Domyoji is kind of like this asshole, he still has this like group of people who, not saying they're good influences, but their friendship or their bond is there. And he also finds someone who falls in love with him in a sense, even if they didn't start off at the right foot, but someone who still saw a level of beauty in that person to be able to like fall in love with them. And I think that's what these types of narratives are trying to kind of are really kind of like at its core why we find them so appealing, is the idea of still being loved or still being accepted when it comes to romance and friendship, or just generally, no matter what the circumstances are. And in a way, there's this hopefulness of this friendship or love will eventually change you to the better version of yourself. And again, I think for the female lead, or at least our attraction towards these characters, or why we sympathize with the female lead of being able to like fall in love with these main characters, like the bad boy trope, is because in a sense, it also nurtures our idea of wanting to connect with someone or create connections that is unique towards someone else. And I think that's like the romance aspect of it, is being able to find this unique connection with someone and have this unique relationship that you know is something that is completely different from the other people that is surrounding you. And again, while this all sounds beautiful in fiction, and I'm mostly focusing on just the fictional aspect of it first, right? I think that's where the appeal of it is. So no matter how much these narratives seem cliche to us now, if we're thrown into the plot of someone who is obnoxiously toxic, mostly a red flag. I think the example of this would be in K-drama with Nevertheless, right? And how, as much as not a lot of people agree with that kind of like how it ended, because from what my understanding, it ended differently in the manhwa or webtoon as compared to the series. There are still some understanding as to why there's still an attraction when it comes to, you know, the main lead and why that is, and all these other things. So to some extent, like, I know we try to rationalize how we look at fiction at times, but there is still a basis as to why this is still a very much popular trope when it comes to pop culture, why we're still attracted to these types of stories. And there's a sense of excitement in trying to find out like how there's a certain, like, sometimes we want to watch something that stings because at the end of it there's satisfaction when we reach the conclusion that we want or we hope for these characters. And I think the harder you pull when it comes to the pain level of dealing with all these toxicity, red flags, all these things, the stronger the satisfaction is in the end when they do end up together, something like that. But again, this is mostly emphasizing on the fictional aspect of it. Going to the media conversation and how that translates to real life and how that is, I think, mostly for people who are within the same generation as me or even a little bit older. So I was born in 1995. Again, as I mentioned, some of these narratives, at least in the Western front, are a more mainstream front, but it's still prevalent in Asian media. This types of narratives kind of like has been reduced or sized down simply because of the changing narratives when it comes to toxicity, red flag, gaslighting, and relationships, all these things. However, for our generation, at least for people who were teenagers or during their formative years or on the same age as when we were kind of like growing up, this is the most common trope in the media that we consume, whether that's in dramas, movies, or even in books or mangas or anything, especially when it comes to romance novels. And so I'm just particularly curious as to how that affected our preferences when it comes to romance. And it's just super interesting to know that I think just generally there's a lot of pull in terms of whether you're going for the good, nice guy. And again, it's a different conversation when it comes to nice guy versus an actual nice guy versus the red flag, bad boy type of story. You know, all these other things. Again, there's a lot of complications when it comes to this, but we're going to just focus on the basics and talk about it on a preferential level and how our pop culture influences may have also translated into our real life preferences. And I think for this, like, we were so used to sitting down and watching series after series, movies after movies, reading pages after pages of how the seemingly toxic red flag character was changed at the end of the series or the movie or the book. And to some extent, it feeds onto the aspirations of us as vulnerable human beings, and we might want that for ourselves. And it also doesn't help that media keeps on feeding this fantasy that when a character gets into a relationship with someone who's nice and safe and comfortable, the main character often vocalizes their frustration over something that is too safe, with less excitement and just something that's monotonous. But I think in real life, that's not something that we would want for ourselves. What's best for everybody is to be in healthy relationships, although there is a massive influence of our preferences when it comes to these things because there's a certain attraction to, again, the biological need to have a unique connection and relationship with someone. And most of that has to do with wanting to nurture and ask or be loved despite of, you know. And again, I'm not saying that it's the best way to go. It's just mostly how it is. Now, going back to like the fictional side of things, or at least the relationship of that, and why we kind of why there's the possibility of blurring those two different blurring the lines between, you know, our fictional preferences and real life, is because we're meant to sympathize with these characters because of their backstories. The narrative kind of like justifies why they are the way that they are, and the turning point of their character is meeting whoever it is that they're partnered with in the narrative. it's the same with us, where in real life we try to justify the negativity that we see in a person if we learn more about them. And I think that's where the dangers start, is because when we start overly thinking about, this is what happened to them and therefore they're entitled to act a certain way. And I feel like that in itself is something that we should definitely draw the line when it comes to what's acceptable in fiction versus what we accept in our real lives. But again, as much as we don't want to admit it, media has that heavy influence and heavy relationship with who we are, and how it kind of like shaped the way that we see the world and the way we see things. I think real life is very unpredictable to be able to pattern it over fictional patterns that we've seen in media, but it is something that we continue to aspire to follow. And it's truly fascinating, but also something that is very cautionary and dangerous in a sense. And I think the reason, and I think overall, just looking at all these different sides, so what is the consensus? Like, we continue, like, it's easy to say that we should ban these types of media because of the influence that you're getting, whatever. But at the same time, like, we know that it is somewhat impossible, because we find joy and excitement into these narratives, because sometimes it's something that we don't want to experience in real life, and we just want something to see unfold because of the excitement that it brings us entertainment wise. And that's what entertainment is. It's somewhere that we can live vicariously through, and all these other aspects, right? And doesn't necessarily have to be something that we follow in real life, especially when it comes to relationships. Maybe this kind of like red flag toxic type of relationships is just something that we want to see on screen, but we know for ourselves and we trust ourselves to know that this is not something that we'll dive deep into in our real lives, and that's fine. But how it is for people who are impressionable, or people who find this as inspiring or anything like that, I think honestly I have no answer. And that's a reason why I'm making this video, is because I just want to explore how fascinating it is that media may have that kind of like influence in our lives, and at the same time it may be real life experiences that draw these artists and creatives to create these types of narratives in the first place. And there's just a cyclic relationship between both real life and fiction that translates to these stories, love stories and tropes and all these things. It might be patterned to someone that they know, or someone they fell in love with, or their own experiences, or it can just be drawn from their own creativity, or it's just tapping into something that we all want to aspire and have. And it's an endless conversation. And I think that's human nature, especially when it comes to romance. It's very unpredictable and fickle. But here's to reminding everyone that red flags may be good on paper or on screen, but it's not something that you should chase for. It's not something that you should wave at in your real life. And I think having this constant conversation about it, on why we find it so attractive on fiction, on pop culture, it shouldn't serve as inspiration to make that into a reality, but would serve us as a reminder that as exciting as these things are, at least on how we see it, it should also be able to provide us with a perspective of what we don't want to happen to us, or how what we should look for in relationships. And that goes just beyond romance, but even for friendships as well. And I think we can move towards being smarter when it comes to consuming this type of these types of things, and having these conversations again kind of like amplifies that. Just because we find something entertaining or exciting or anything like that, it should also teach us something in the end, and not necessarily something that we should copy, but something that we should learn for. No matter how shallow a piece of media is or something like that, there's always a takeaway from it. And that also goes for this attraction to the broody bad boy trope. And yeah, so I think that's mostly what this conversation is about. I don't know. Like, tell me down in the comments below, what else do you want to add to this discourse, conversation, whatever. What are your entries towards that kind of like meme of saying, you know, your attraction to toxic men started when X versus Y. So who's your X versus Y? And if you want to check out my other videos when it comes to Hanayaridango, Boys Over Flowers, all these other things, they're in the playlists here on my channel. But yeah, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel and you would want to hear more from me, please hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you again soon in a new one.